Are there examples of these companies?
I was able to work with brands like Rimowa, Apple, Wired Magazine, musicians on tour like John Mayer or Fatboy Slim. And it was fun because it was just like visual design.
You're Instagram famous now. How did you grow so many followers?
I remember my phone started buzzing like crazy and I was like, what happened? And I just posted this one visualization and I think that got like 1 million views in like 24 hours.
What do you think is the next adaptation?
Like asking a VC firm to stand up a design function is pretty unique. But what I realized is like working with founders, unblocking them on design, starting to build product internally, and then like owning Drive Design, which also includes like our merch, which also includes like our events, the flags outside our building.
Are there points in your story where it wasn't all amazing?
Work hard, grind, get through it, like figure it out. In my opinion, there's like no challenge you can't figure out. Some are harder and may take a lot more work. You might fumble a couple times, but I think you just gotta believe and follow your gut.
What do you understand about the world that other people don't?
Let me think.
The Yesterday podcast is brought to you by Ro, the all-in-one banking platform for startups. Thousands of companies use Ro. You get everything you need to manage your startup's cash. Fast banking setup, cards with up to 2% cashback, and yield that turns your company cash into extra runway. All super useful in the early days of launching. But the thing founders really love about Ro is their team. Candidly, they were amazing to partner with us on. They're about 3 hours ahead of my time zone. I don't think they ever took over 10 minutes to respond back to a text or email of mine. They're obsessed with helping founders beat industry giants, and will go to the end of the earth to help them do so. Exclusively for Yesterday Pod listeners and viewers, you'll get a $1,500 statement credit and tons of exclusive perks when you manage your company cash with Ro. Terms and conditions apply. To learn more, visit ro.co/yesterday. That's rho.co/yesterday. Ro's a fintech, not a bank. Checking and card services provided by Webster Bank. Member FDIC. See rewards terms for details.
If you think back to little Frank, what did little Frank actually do as a kid? Where were you spending your extra time? Where did you go to elementary school? Or where did you go to middle school? Obviously, we I guess for the cameras, we grew up in similar areas. And I also went to UVA for some amount of time. Where were you actually spending your time and what places? Were your friends? What are your friends doing now? Dig into that.
My parents had me come to the United States and like they picked Virginia and what was nice about that is that my aunts and uncles also came from both sides of my family. Yeah. So my cousin network was like my family. Yeah. We'd have sleepovers on the weekends and then it was just being a kid. And my dad worked in the restaurant business growing up. And so I remember, he always told me don't go into the restaurant business. Yeah. The beauty of the restaurant business is like you're providing like this amazing experience for people. I think the downside, and especially from his perspective, is that you're doing it when people's days are off, right? So he was always working on the weekends or holidays. You would just see like what it means to be the best client service, and like deliver the best product. And also just how to work hard. My dad, started from like the back of the kitchen and worked his way up to the top. And I think seeing that like just tenacity was something that he instilled in us. And like whatever you do, just be the best at it. I remember he always said that, like just put all your effort in, be nice, but work hard. I thought for me, how to do that was to be good at school, listen to authority and try to be a doctor. It was just like what I wanted to do. Because again, I enjoyed math and science. I didn't really appreciate I wasn't as big a fan of like history and literature. And so I felt like, okay, that made sense. Let's go that direction.
And so, okay, you go to UVA. What was that experience like?
When I applied to colleges, my parents were like, you got to apply to in-state school. I was fortunate that Virginia was one of them, but I also applied to one art school in DC, which I don't think no longer exists, but it's Corcoran College of Art and Design. And I remember making a decision at that point, being like, am I going to go to art school or am I going to go to like a liberal arts school? Because I thought being a doctor was the path. I decided to go to UVA and focus on that. And it was great. I took one art class in UVA and it was like really fun, but everything else was just like the bios, the orgos, physics. And then when I graduated, I had taken the MCATs. I was ready to apply to med school, but I was like, I kind of want to see firsthand, what does it feel like to work in the healthcare industry? And then also, just really consider if this is something I want to do before I commit to like, med school and residency and all the commitment that comes with that. And so I was able to work as a scribe for 2 years coming out of UVA at a Trauma One Hospital Center outside of DC. Yeah. And that was amazing because it did give me that experience and I was pretty bullish on going to med school even more after that because I was like, this is such a fun environment. You're actually helping people and you got to work with doctors and who were able to provide like mentorship, and like guidance. But ironically, I think because of the scribe program existing, we were going from paper chart to electronic medical records. I think doctors were, being asked to see more patients and reduce the SLA. And so it was perfect to have a scribe, right? You had somebody younger who was more comfortable with computers, take all the documentation, order lab results, et cetera, or labs. The doctors, though, were pretty jaded. And they were like, don't go into medicine, do something else. And I was like, well, what am I going to do? And I remember one doctor asked me to help them with like a book cover design for a book they were publishing. And if I look back at the design now, it's pretty embarrassing. But I did that, and then I helped another doctor do a medical illustration for a journal they were submitting to. And they were like, you got to do something like that. You go do something creative. And I was like, but what does that mean? And I think for me, I remember I was like, I don't want to just go become an artist. Like, I just thought that I didn't know what that would look like. And I also really enjoyed the math and the sciences. So I think something more technical or something related to like strategy or having some constraints I thought was more appealing. So I did do some soul searching during that time. And I was like, okay, what could I do? And before I went to my parents and say, hey, I don't want to be a doctor, I want to be an artist, you know? I was like, how do I frame this in a way that they'll be bought in? And so I think going back to the education thing, I was like, I can go get a master's degree, go to portfolio school.
Who were your friends? Were they all in pre-med or med? And when do you think you had a bit of an inkling? Sure, you had a bit later on, but okay, go do your own thing, or kind of veer off the path of, you know, listening to authority or doing what your parents thought was best.
Yeah, so when I went to, you know, it's funny about UVA is like, because my parents didn't go to University of the United States, like I didn't have this like, watch college football on Saturdays, like understand like the universities to the level that I think some of my friends did going into it. Like I remember my parents were like, apply to state schools just because it was going to be, you know, more cost effective. And I remember I applied to, I think, every school in Virginia. I got into UVA, and I remember telling my teachers, and like, wow, congrats, that's amazing, you know, people were excited about that. Like, and I was like, okay, cool. I remember submitting back the form, you know, it was like a postcard that came in your application where it was like, I accept, or I'm willing to go. I never visited UVA. Yeah. And so I just sent that back, and I was like, I'm going to UVA. And so when I showed up, it was my first time like really being on campus, or grounds as we call it, and experiencing that. And it was also funny because I was in a dorm, and it was one of the old dorms, which I know was like a coveted thing, but I was on the basement floor. So there's only like 4 rooms.
I was as well. Yeah.
It was just fun because I got to know that crew of people really well. And some of my closest friends to this day who also live in New York were in that hall. It was great. We were in the basement, and like half the basement was dorm rooms, and the other half was like the maintenance team. And so we became really friends with those guys. And it was just like a fun experience. And I think for me, UVA was interesting because it was my first time experiencing Greek life and like that whole side. Sports.
Were you in a frat?
I was not. I remember telling my parents, I was like, I think I'm going to join a fraternity. Like, that sounds great. And then I was like, yeah, it costs this much, you know, semester. And they're like, you're not doing that. And I was like, all right. Which I think looking back was probably the right choice for me. I might have gone a little too hard, but I had friends who were in it, so I still had like the pseudo experience. But I loved it. I remember I joined the newspaper as like the photo editor. And again, I picked up, I think I love gadgets. So I think cameras and computers were a thing that I just gravitated towards. And being on the daily, was it Daily Cavalier? Being the photo editor was amazing because you get to go to events, you get to go to sporting events. I got to sit baseline, like at some amazing games. But then you're responsible for telling a story. And so that was a fun opportunity to like take photos, get better at that, be at these events, but then go back and be like, okay, but this is going to run tomorrow, you know, and like also run a team of photographers. And so I did that, and that was like a creative outlet that I think was more just like I wanted to do this, again, probably to boost my resume for med school, but I really enjoyed it. And I remember I took one art class at UVA, and that was like so amazing. I remember like, wow, like, you know, because everything else was so like focus on the exams, and this was just like paint, and I really enjoyed that part. But again, I always told myself like, that's gonna be a hobby, not something I take serious. And I was fortunate that a school not too far from UVA, at VCU in Richmond, had a program called Brandcenter, which is really catered towards advertising. And I thought it was an interesting combination of what I wanted to do, because in order to do effective advertising, you have to understand like the objectives, right? What's the campaign? What are the metrics you're trying to reach? What are you trying to sell? And as the art director, your role is to kind of bring it to life, sell an idea, sell a concept. And so I did that, and it was amazing because that was the first time after UVA when I went to this grad program where I was able to actually like tap into that creative side in an academic setting. And I felt like it was a massive unlock for me. I was like, oh, this is really fun. Now, the program wasn't a design school, so even though I was the art director and I had to do a lot of design stuff, you were kind of on your own in terms of like what was the medium you wanted to use. So I learned, you know, about the different tools, got better at Photoshop, you know, the Adobe Creative Suite. I picked up 3D motion graphics there because I felt like that was a way to bring things to life. And I really enjoyed how all those tools kind of felt technical, but, you know, visual executions. And so I remember between first and second year of grad school, I actually went out to San Francisco. I worked at an agency called AKQA as an intern. And being from the East Coast, I was like, oh, I get the West Coast dream now. Like, I want to come back here. And it was an interesting time there, too, because...
Do you remember where you stayed in SF?
In the Mission, 16th and Dolores, which is also an amazing time to be there, too. And at this time, I remember Lyft, Uber were becoming more prominent. Like, I think you still had to fist pump the Lyft drivers when you got in the car. And it was just like a fun, like the tech scene was kind of like just contagious and like exciting there. And I was set on going back.
When did you get into tech though?
So I got a job in New York after grad school that was in advertising at an agency here in New York called Mother New York. And that's how I thought I was going to do advertising. A lot of my friends, my wife's still in it. Yeah. But for me, I realized that advertising, while it was really fun and it was a creative outlet and there was still like the business side of things, I felt like you spent so much time putting these campaigns together that had a shelf life, you know, a seasonal campaign or a Super Bowl spot. It was great, but it was like short-lived. And so I was like, what can I do to apply what I do that has a longer, you know, life cycle? And so I started kind of rethinking what am I going to do next. And one of the benefits of the program that I went to for grad school is that the alumni network is pretty rich, especially in the advertising angle, but there's a lot of people who've kind of stepped outside. And through that network, I was able to talk to someone who was working at the creative lab here at Google in New York. And so I went over there as a contractor. And they have an interesting model where they're able to bring in people who might not necessarily fit the bill of like what Google will hire right away, like engineering, as a contractor, and you get to spend up to 2 years there, and then you have to renew or step away, or you can convert to full time. And it was great because I wasn't like, I could still kind of keep my ear to the ground as like what else was happening if I was interested, but I had this essentially full-time role at the creative lab at Google where we did a hybrid of marketing, campaign work, storytelling, but also product work. And that was the first time I started thinking about product because I started interacting with some of these teams at Google that had engineers, PMs, and needed product design. And so 2 things that I remember from the creative lab that stick with me today was one, I was there when Google went through their rebrand, which feels like forever ago now, but it was from the serif logo to the new like Super G and the thinking dots. And what was really interesting, the reason for that was because they had shared all this information around that project, but people who were now on their phones more and using things like Apple Maps or Google Maps couldn't tell you which program they were using because it all looked very similar. And so Google was like, we have to have our identity in our products. And so the thinking dots and the Super G was a way to create a very small factor of the logo.
I didn't know that. Huh.
And another thing that I worked on there was focused on the next billion users coming up in India who are going to be on smartphones and using the tools that we have here in the United States. But the audience that they were thinking about was very data conscious. And for a product like Maps, not a lot of people the areas we were looking at didn't have traditional street addresses. So how do you take a product like Maps that's very data heavy and requires traditional street addresses to a completely audience that doesn't? And so those are 2 projects where I was like, oh, these are interesting, and I can go more into that.
How did you do that? Obviously, my family's from India. There's no fucking street sign. It's nothing.
We did a lot of like, I like to call it like vaporware. We did like a bunch of, and this is the thing, it was like pseudo product design, because we would do like one-off screens, like what if Apple Maps or Google Maps Google Maps had this, or how do we show, I think it was like offloading the maps a lot. So like, you can do like offline mode, like how do you kind of make that more easy for people to do? The traditional street addresses was interesting. I don't know if we totally solved it when I was there. Because people would be like, oh, you go down there, you make a left, you see that building, you make a right, and like, obviously you can't translate that to like a digital product as well. So I don't know if we totally got there, but I think it was really fun to work with the Maps team. And I think the biggest thing I learned is we would show them something and they'd be like, dude, we're not building that. Like, we have a roadmap, we have these priorities you need to build. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's kind of fun to be on that side of the table, the product team. And so towards my end of my 2 years at Creative Lab, I started picking up my head up and be like, hey, what else can I do? And I was really keen on exploring product design as an opportunity. And somebody who I was working with closely at the Creative Lab, she was like, well, you're interested in product design, right? And you were pre-med. And I was like, yeah. She's like, well, my husband works at a startup here in New York that's in the healthcare space, and they're looking for designers. You should talk to them. And that was actually Oscar Health. Yeah. And I remember meeting with the team, and I remember it was actually in the same building. We were on the 5th floor of the Puck building. And I remember walking in, and it wasn't like the prettiest office, but I remember it was like the energy there was crazy. And they took a chance on me because I had no product design experience, but I joined. And I spent around 2 years at Oscar, and it was so fun.
What year was this?
This was probably 2015.
And when was Thrive started?
Around 2010, 2011.
Did you think of venture at the time? And
No,
did you understand what Thrive was, or you didn't even?
No, okay. I totally didn't even know they invested. I knew they gave me money, but I was a designer. I was like, so in my lane.
So you had no clue that you were going Thrive was even.
No, and I remember they were on the 7th floor of the building, so occasionally we'd have to come upstairs for something. Yeah. And I was like walking into the space, like, what is going on here? What does everyone do here?
Was it the same design, same layout?
No. Okay. The Thrive office was only like half the size of this office. Cool. But there was still that Thrive energy. I remember. And when I joined Oscar, there was around 100 employees, and like I said, the 2 designers. And then after 2 years, it went to like 600 plus employees because our membership grew, so we had to kind of grow to support. And the design team went to around 11 designers. So it was a pretty nice growth moment. And I can talk more about like some things there, but I remember one of the things that I really was excited about was like that energy and that growth and like supporting members and like you're building product that like, you know, is impacting people's lives. And also unique to have a startup in New York at the time, right?
At Oscar, there's a story Christian actually mentioned about how it's almost counterintuitive. You made the onboarding flow very fast, and people would get to the end of this onboarding flow for insurance, and they wouldn't convert. And counterintuitively, you added more friction to this onboarding flow, and then the conversion increased. And this is fundamentally a design and product problem, right? Just touch more on that. I think it's very interesting.
You know, the bar was pretty low at the time in terms of like what people expected, especially when an insurance company designing the product experience, the customer experience. There were a couple things that stood out to me. I remember the marketing team sat separate than the product team, and which is great. And we were both doing, you know, heads down doing our work. Everyone was running fast, and the marketing team did an incredible campaign that at the time was pretty novel. It was character illustrations, like very playful illustrations around New York of like, you know, real world or, you know, healthcare experiences. So somebody has a rash on their skin, somebody has like this tummy ache.
Wasn't it very relatable? And then you put billboards up.
Exactly, it was very playful and people were talking about it, I remember. And I think it drew a lot of people to our website to be like, what's Oscar, what is this? You know, especially because we were going for individual health insurance. You got people who I think were more creative or maybe working for themselves who were looking into this. And it was great because it was effective. People were talking about us, wanting to learn more about us. And so one thing was, yes, I remember talking to the marketing team. We had like a Mad Lib on the website, which was pretty novel also at the time, where it was like, I'm, you know, 24 years old, live in New York, I want to cover insurance for myself. And it was pretty easy to do that. And then people would go through the flow, and I think you just wanted to click through, and then ultimately actually sign up for insurance. I remember we got people being like, hey, I didn't mean to do this. Like, can you please unenroll me? And it was an interesting moment because we're like, okay, we made that way too easy, which is good, but also like we don't want people to sign up who don't want to sign up. And so I think there we had to think about how to introduce a little bit of like friction by design so that people are making a choice deliberately and not like accidentally, especially for signing up for insurance, which can be a pain to like have to remove your enrollment or tell your current insurance. And then the other thing we realized from that is that people were excited. Those who wanted to sign up for Oscar were excited to, you know, experience that like playfulness in their brand. But our product team was so focused on designing like a UI that was so clean and minimal, and none of the illustrations were in our product. So people would sign up, they'd open the app, and the app was so sterile. I mean, it looked great in my opinion, but it was so sterile. They're like, what happened to the playfulness that I signed up for? And I think that was a result of us shipping our org chart in a way, right? Like they weren't communicating to each other. People were expecting one thing. And so we also had to do a little bit of like refactoring to be, okay, how do we bring in some of those brand elements into the product, like illustrations, you know, the playfulness, which is also a really interesting learning point. And then the last thing I would say is that we try to really simplify insurance. And I remember we do surveys and people would say like, yeah, I love the brand, I love the ads, I love the product, like, you know, it looks great, but I don't trust it. Like insurance has been so complicated my whole life. Like why all of a sudden is it so easy? Like, you guys must not be getting something right. And so then we had to think about, okay, how do we become like the experts in insurance, even though we're making it simple? So like a glossary of terms, you know, all this stuff with SEO, like educational stuff to show that we know all these parts of it. You know, the EOB, like how do you make it so that it's still reflective of what people expect, but easier to understand without it seeming like we're missing something. And so these are all interesting things that I still think about today, where like if you design an incredible brand and it outward facing, it's striking, it's engaging, how do you make sure that your digital product also has that same kind of, you know, embodies that, right? Because I think you don't want to have like a door that looks one way and then the inside looks completely different. And on the friction side, I think you just have to be deliberate around how users, you know, as we work with companies and we support our founders and they're thinking about these things, like, yeah, how do you make it as easy as possible to do something, but still have credibility and trust? And I think, you know, that's something we always talk about as we think about product design or some of these user experiences. I remember talking to people at Oscar who were there from the early days, and I just heard like the stories, you know, like the battle wounds and all this stuff. It was really interesting to hear about like the 0 to 1 days. And I remember somebody told me like, if you ever get the chance to be on a founding team, you should take that opportunity. And I got reached out to by Sidewalk Labs, which no longer exists, but was part of the Alphabet family. And they were incubating companies focused on this ambitious goal of like building the city of the future. And one of the areas they wanted to build a company around was thinking of, you know, the healthcare of this population. And so I got reached out to, to be on the founding team of a company that we're incubating out of Sidewalk Labs. And so I took the chance, and I was like, this is the opportunity to do that 0 to 1. And that was City Block Health. And so City Block Health was incubated out of Sidewalk Labs, but Thrive was actually one of the investors in the earlier rounds. And so again, I got familiar with Thrive back in a company that I was a part of. Now they incubated Oscar, but now they were investing in City Block. And again, didn't have much touch points with Thrive, but was appreciative of the fact that they were supporting companies that I was working at. And that was amazing because that's 0 to 1, right? So we had to name the company, we had to do the initial identity, obviously the product design. And as the only designer, I wore like all the hats that, anything that needed to be done, I had to kind of do in terms of the visual stuff.
I want to touch a bit more on Sidewalk Labs. We didn't touch too much on it. I think the companies doing the brains work with are phenomenal. They're sort of the marquee iconic brands. Just touch a bit more on those. Which ones were your favorite projects? Which ones, I don't know what the metric is for maybe measuring the effectiveness of a design project, but maybe it's the amount of people who viewed it, interacted with it. I don't know, but if there was some metric, what is the metric, and then which one was the most successful, or throw the metrics at the door, which one was the most successful in fully subjective terms?
So Sidewalk Labs is really interesting because, like I mentioned, it was ambitious. I remember when I got the first call and I was like, we're trying to start to build a company, and then I remember when I first joined, I think the conversations with Sidewalk Labs about building the city of the future, and it was in Toronto, was like still in the works when I was interviewing, but when I joined shortly thereafter, like, okay, we're building the city in Toronto, and like, the way they were doing that was they were starting companies today, it takes 10, 15, 20 years to build a city. So it was like, if we start these companies now and like get them out there today, then when this city does roll out, we'll have like, these actual companies that can just roll into this. And so some of the teams were looking at like parking signs and how do you make that more easy to understand. One team was looking at like, do we need sidewalks? Like sidewalk, why do streets and sidewalks cross each other? And like, it was just like so crazy. And then our team was looking at like, how do you think about the medical and social care of of the population? And so that's what City Block started off. It was like, how do you bring in, let's say a patient is diabetic, and not only do they need diabetes medication and see their doctor, but they also might need nutrition, right? And they might need like things that fall a little bit outside of the medical scope. And so we built a care management platform that allowed anybody that was caring for this patient, social worker, care guides, family, doctor, to have the same visibility. So like, what are the priorities we're focusing on? And it was really interesting because you were helping a population of people that really needed help, but bringing them, which felt novel, like the idea of, again, the medical and social elements into play, right? On the diabetes example, like we saw a couple of patients that like, they needed to eat well and obviously take their medication, but they lived in a food desert. And so like there was just no access to good food. And so we would partner with, do we partner with one of these food delivery services? And so it was really fun to work on that and like, again, build everything from 0 to 1. I do feel, having stepped away, I felt like my time there wasn't done, but I had this opportunity to go do my own thing, and it just felt like I had to strike while the iron was hot. And I remember, since the journey I just walked you through since grad school, I mentioned I picked up like 3D motion graphics as a tool. Throughout that journey, I fell in love with 3D. Like I'd go home and just like do more renderings, learn Cinema 4D, Redshift, Houdini, build computers with more GPU power. And I would go home and make these things when I had time, and I would show my girlfriend, now wife, and she'd be like, cool. And I kept showing her, she's like, cool. She's like, just put it on the internet. And I was like, okay. So I started an Instagram account. And that was I just wanted to put things out there.
You're Instagram famous now.
I don't maintain that account as much anymore, but it got a following. And I think it was really exciting to see that the people were appreciative of what I was doing.
I looked at the profile. You just posted your designs. You didn't really put your name on it.
No,
as much.
Exactly.
How did you grow so many followers?
Yeah, the account was supposed to never be about me. It was supposed to be like my experiments. And I'll never forget the post that blew up. I was at like lunch with my girlfriend, my wife now, and her mom, and we were at lunch, and I remember my phone just started buzzing like crazy, and I was like, what happened? And I just posted this one visualization of like this squishy, I had a thing with squishy blobs.
It'll pop it up on the screen.
A squishy blob going up to a tube, and it had this moment of tension where like it almost didn't go in, and it squeezes itself in, and I think that got like 1 million views in like 24 hours, and I think that was a catalyst for people starting to follow. But it also created pressure for me because I was like, oh man, that one did so well. Is my next post going to do well? But I kind of let that part go in terms of like the pressure and just continued to post things that I wanted to post. And then I was fortunate from the following, people were reaching out to like, hey, are you available for freelance? Do you take any freelance work on? And given that at the time I was either at Oscar or City Block, I could only take on things that had longer turnaround times, like 3 to 4 weeks, just because I couldn't commit to a week turnaround. And so I was able to take on some projects, smaller clients, And it was really fun because I got to learn about like the business side of things, right? How do you invoice? How do you contract? How do you price yourself? And when I was towards my time at CityBlock, I hit an inflection point where now I was getting reached out to by companies that I really wanted to work with. Think of like the Adidas, Apple. And in order to work with them, you had to really be available full time.
Yeah.
And so I made the decision to step away from product and CityBlock and just go work for myself. And I did it for about 4 years. And the first 2 years were really focused on just like motion graphics and visual design. So I was able to work with brands like Rimowa, Apple, Wired Magazine, musicians on tour like John Mayer or Fatboy Slim.
Awesome.
And it was fun because it was just like visual design. It was, you know, product design is a business objective.
Yeah.
You're thinking about your users. This was just like make something that looks cool.
Is design constant across like a musician to Apple to Wired? Like, is it the same skill set, or you're just reinventing yourself?
You know, it's funny. I think I had a theme, right? People like that I try to do like satisfying kind of videos, and so oftentimes I'd see brands be like, "Hey, can you put squishy balls around our product?"
Yeah.
Like literally, be like, "We got a shoe drop and make them squishy balls in it." Or Rimowa was like making it around the luggage, and it was great because like I could do those things. So I got used to it, but I try to find ways to have some variation amongst my work. And so I mentioned this to a colleague the other day, like, you know, I have tattoos, and I remember one of the tattoos I really wanted to get was, it was less about the exact tattoo, but it was about the tattoo artist I wanted to work with. And I couldn't get in his books. He was booked out like 6 months in advance.
It's pretty, I don't know if the right word is counterintuitive, but I've never heard that.
What,
to work with the artist, sure, but you didn't even care about what was going on.
Well, I knew like if I met the person, we could kind of come up with the design together.
Interesting. When did you get your first tattoo?
My first tattoo, when did I get it?
Yeah.
I think I was like 22.
How many do you have now?
Oh God, I have a whole sleeve. I have some here, my leg. But I always remember like, I liked the artists because I appreciated their style and like their craft and everything. And so I figured we could figure out, I'm ironically not precious about what I get tattooed on me. It's about who tattoos me. But this particular artist, I couldn't get a book with him. And then tattoo artists will often have what they call flash days. Where they essentially say like, here are 6 designs I'm gonna tattoo. If you want one of these, you can get it in the next couple of weeks, but you can't modify the tattoo at all. So you kind of got to just get what they want. And I used it as an opportunity to get a tattoo from the artist that I wanted. And then I built a relationship with him that day, and I was able to get in his books for you know, future tattoos easier. But I remember asking him.
in New York?
Yeah, he was in New York. I think he's based out of Salem now. But during my session with him, we spent like 4 hours with the person. I remember asking him like, why do you do flash days? And he said, you know, sometimes I find myself, I'll do a tattoo, I'll post it on my account, and then like 20 people come back and like, I want that tattoo. Or if he does a flower, I want flowers. And he goes, the reason I do flash days is because I don't want to just keep doing flowers. I want to do a skull, or I want to do something else. And so that gives me the opportunity to do a design he wants to do, or they want to do, that then nobody can kind of modify. And I thought that was really interesting. And I was like, I kind of started treating my Instagram account that way, where I'm like, yes, I'm getting asked to do squishy balls a lot, but I kind of want to do a particle thing, or I want to do this thing. And so it actually worked out, because then brands would be like, oh, can we get that particle system with ours? And so I created this like, you know, flash Instagram account where I just showed all my experiments, and then it worked out that clients would see that. Now I still would get asked for squishy balls, but I could show them other things, and they'd be like, let's try that. But yeah, so going back to so I was doing that for around 2 years, pretty consistently, working with, you know, just different types of clients and working on more visual design stuff. And then naturally my network started reaching out, people who are at Oscar, who maybe went to go join an early stage company, or somebody who wanted to start a company. Hey Frank, are you able to help me out with like visual identity or website, or, you know, just general design stuff? And I started taking on those projects as well. What I really enjoyed about, you know, the freelancing and working for myself was I was fortunate to work with some amazing brands. I remember one project specifically, and this really validated the reason why I decided to leave, because I needed the quick turnarounds. I got hit up by Wired Magazine, and they're like, are you available for a quick 24-hour turnaround on a render for the cover of Wired Magazine? And I was like, let's do it. And it was an article that they'd written, and it was about like Facebook and Mark, and they wanted this cover to be done. And it was so fast. I remember it was so fast. And I did it, and they shipped it. And then I remember I was on a trip the next week, and I'm at the airport.
You saw it?
And I saw it, and I was like, man, this is crazy. You know, and that was like a fun one where I would have never had the opportunity to do it had I been working somewhere.
Why did they go to you for a 24-hour thing, and who did they have before?
It's a great question. The story had been written, and it was like one of those things where it's like it took the cover story. So it was like a last minute. They landed the story. They needed to move quickly. So I think they had something lined up, but they had to pivot. And then why me? You know, that's the thing I was really fortunate about my time working for myself, was that it was all word of mouth. I never really had a campaign or like, you know, cold outbound. I got a lot of references, or people would see work and be like, can you do that? Can you get me squishy balls for my product? And it was great. And one of the brands I worked with pretty early on was Rimowa. And at that time, I think they'd just gotten new leadership, and they really wanted to become like a brand that was, luxury, but catered towards a younger audience. And so it was really fun. I worked with them on a bunch of different campaigns, and they were what I really appreciate about the relationship with them was that they were very, they had to give me a lot of autonomy. Like, just do you, but like make sure our luggage is there,
Yeah.
And that's fun, because that way you can like have fun and do things.
Are any of your designs from them still on the website or still?
I don't know. We published something on was it O32C magazine?
Okay.
That campaign, I think, actually won a Red Dot award, which is crazy.
What is that? I haven't heard of that. What is a Red Dot?
A Red Dot is like a design award that people,
Is it like the award? Or is
I don't know. It's one of the awards,
Yeah.
if you will. But it was just cool. I mean, it was like there were many different artists that worked on that campaign, but it was cool to be a part of that. I think I have it on my website, and that obviously you can share. But it was like just really fun to get that freedom and flexibility. And then I think what I really appreciate was people hiring me to do me. Like. And I think that's where people were like, hey, I want to work with Frank. It wasn't like I just want 3D, like they want to work with me. And sometimes you get the other side and people just needed 3D and they needed you. But it was really fun when you got to work with clients that were like, we just want your touch.
What is Frank? What is your version of design?
Photorealism. Like the shadows have to be right, the lighting has to be right, the textures have to be realistic, which is why I needed beefier computers.
Yeah.
Which is why I needed, more GPUs, where I learned Redshift. Like I just had this, I was just drawn to photorealism, but with a very big twist of surrealism. And so that's where like I can mess with gravity, I can mess with the physics, but it looked real. So I think that's where I think that's where I found my niche, I think, is like making things look realistic, but not move the way you expect them to move, And I think that was kind of the sweet spot I identified. It was almost like visual ASMR. And I remember Thrive reached out.
Was it Willem?
Yeah, Willem reached out, and he's like, hey, we see that you worked in our portfolio. You're freelancing. We support a lot of our early stage companies with design. Would you be down to kind of work with us? Not on a retainer, but a pretty consistent basis.
Well, I think what Willem said, and maybe I misheard it, but he said he really wanted to hire you, but he couldn't. And so the best way to get you in the door was to contract you. And then he roped you in. And
no, exactly. And I remember when he did reach out, I was like, sure, why not? Like I'm working for myself. Like let me take on some more clients. But it was my first time that I actually interacted with Thrive directly and the team and the founders and even coming to the office, and it was amazing because I got to see this like what felt like a black box to a lot of people. I was on the inside and I was just impressed. I think people had a high slope, high velocity, really talented, but really nice. And I think that combination felt like the perfect storm. And then the founders that were backing were all incredibly impressive. Yeah. And then being able to work with them directly and having that relationship was pretty unique because even as a contractor, when I worked on other projects, I felt like there was always like a middle person that kind of, was moderating the project, if you will. Whereas Willem was very much that, but there was still my opportunity to work directly with the founder. And so I remember towards the end I worked for myself for around 4 years. Towards the end of that time, I remember Willem was like, hey, we're thinking about growing the team. We want to have some conversations. Yeah. And given that I was working for myself, I was like, I'll take the calls, right? I think it was like the hardest and longest interview process I've ever had. And a lot of it had to do with, I think the challenging questions I got in the interview process were challenging because it made me really have a lot of like reflection on like, what do I want in my next role, right? And I remember thinking about this. I was like, I can continue to do what I'm doing, continue to work with my clients, but what would I gain out of like taking the chance and doing something a little bit different? And I think for me, it was getting challenged in areas that I wasn't being challenged. As a freelancer, especially in the design world or creative world, you're usually scoped based on a project, you're kind of executing things. Even working with Thrive, I was able to be more strategic and like ask questions like, why are we doing this? Is this the right way to do this? And the opportunity to do that more in-house, I thought was really appealing. Being part of the team and surrounding myself with people who I thought were really talented. And I remember when I first joined, I was told you're not going to be doing design work at Thrive directly. We outsource that, but you get to do a lot of other things with the founders. And so I joined the incubation team, and my role there was just like help the founders however they need to be helped. And what that looked like was taking expert calls, doing like customer surveys, thinking about their product roadmap, like really being more high level, which I really enjoyed. But then naturally things would come up where like a founder was meeting with a big potential client the next day and they need prepare materials for that. In order for me to find a contractor, onboard them, give them context in that timeline.
You just did it.
Exactly, and I started doing that. And then that happened more and more with the incubations, but even some of the investors caught wind like, hey, can you work with this founder who we, the seed investment or Series A. And then at the same time, I remember Anuj came to me one day and he was like, hey, I'm thinking about building this like product internally. Do you know any product designers that'd be available? And I was like, I'll do it. And I remember it was like, hey, fine, but only 10% of your time because you're focused on other stuff. Like, sure. And that was Thrive One, which is a product we're building here. And it was fun because now I never thought I was gonna be able to build product at Thrive. And I think, personally, I enjoyed that, like continue to refine the craft, but also it gave me empathy with founders. They're all builders in their building. Yeah. And if you're helping them build something and you're also building something, you can kind of share notes, you can share best practices. And I think it's something that just makes us feel a little bit more like we're collaborating the right way with them versus just telling them how to build something. If we're actually building, we can, again, speak the same language. And then the last area that I started, taking on is thinking about just Thrive design, I call it. And what that means is I remember joining and seeing presentations at Thrive, and the material was great in terms of the content, but visually there was a bit of like just chaos. Like the logo was in this color, the slides looked like this font was being used.
Who designed this logo?
That logo was designed by, I believe, Grand Army.
And then you made the 3D. Okay.
Yeah, and the funny thing about the logo is that it's actually an abstract T and a C, which people don't see. So it's like the top of the T on the left and then the C on the right, so it's Thrive Capital.
Interesting. When I was with Kareem Zaki, I asked him, what was your best non-consensus hire? Maybe I mentioned this when we were hanging out. It was no hesitation, just Frank. There's no reason a venture firm should have a head of design, but it's one of the best things they've ever done at this firm. And so he was very particular about it. I mean, it's played out obviously very well.
Yeah. I mean, it's been amazing. Yeah. And when I first joined, there wasn't a design function. I wasn't supposed to be doing design. Yeah.
Was Willem designing or no?
He was.
Okay.
But Willem was like running the entire team. So he was thinking about the residency program. He was meeting with founders. So he had a lot on his plate. What I realized is like working with founders, unblocking them on design, starting to build product internally, and then like owning Thrive Design, which also includes like our merch, which also includes like our events, the flags outside our building. I remember going to Josh after a year and a half, being like, I think there's an opportunity here to just stand up a design function. And I think Willem was a great partner in kind of helping me frame the reasons for why. And I had all the case studies, and you never know how those things are going to land, right? Like asking a VC firm to stand up a design function is pretty unique. But Josh is someone that really appreciates design and brand, and I think seeing that and seeing the materials that I showed that we're already doing this, now we can formalize it. He's like, let's do it. And so the design function started, I think initially it was what I just described: portfolio support, indexing on early stage, product design, Thrive One, and then like Thrive Design. And I remember I got the green light and I felt like, okay, we got to show the value of this. And it became really nice that the founders were asking more of this. We had a lot of strategy internally we're working on that required design. And now Thrive One is like, I'd say 40% of my time, 50% of my time. Yeah. We have a whole project engineering team. And on the Thrive Design side, like I really appreciate the fact that I get to work closely with our comms team to think about Investor Day, think about, again, how our flag looks at our building, our merch we take pretty seriously. And so I get to explore all these different areas, which I think is just really fulfilling.
What is the naming process? Like, explain that.
So the naming process, and this is something that Willem kind of pioneered here at Thrive, or he had done it prior to. We have this process where the goal, if you ask people to give you names for a company, I think naturally they're going to gravitate towards themes or words that are probably really close to what they're building, right? So let's say a security company, you might think of like, a lock, or like, I don't know, something with around like a fence or a gate or something, which aren't bad ideas, those are good ideas. But what we try to do is get founders and the founding team to think a little bit more outside the box. And so we run this process where we call them springboards, and we come up with naming themes. And so the naming theme should be kind of values that we want the name of the company to embody, and and we try to get 9 themes, which sounds like a lot, but the reason for that is that each of the themes should be slightly different from one another. So as an example, I remember Neon, which is Neon Pay, and their focus on helping game developers. And I remember when we did one of the naming themes we had there was game artifacts, right? They're they're supporting game developers. Another one was like speed, like just being fast, security. And Neon came about because you think of an arcade, and like there's neon everywhere in an arcade. If you think of like speed, I don't know, like neon as an element too, like it moves quickly. And so that's an example where basically we get these name themes, And then from there we springboard. And so the idea there is that you come up with as many words associated to that theme. And with some of the companies we've named, we've had like 700 naming candidates.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes we do 100. And I think what's nice about that is like you cover your bases to not just over-index on maybe one category of names, which is incredibly helpful today because getting .coms are harder, more expensive. Trademark is always a little trickier now with so many companies. And so this gives an opportunity to give something that maybe is not what you would normally expect for this company, but when you hear why and the themes it came from, it makes sense. And so that's kind of the naming process. And what I tell founders all the time, it's not about what you like or don't like in a name when we're coming up with a name. It's about what works or why it works. And you have to define what makes the criteria for why something should work. And two of the criteria are trademark. Are we going to have any risks there? Domain availability. You know, if the founder wants a .com, like, okay, do we want just the word .com? Do we want like a word before or after .com? Are you open to .co, .io? And then the criteria, which is part of the naming themes that we talk about. And, you know, in my time doing this, and I don't think I've ever met a founder who even through this process at the end, we land on the name, they're like, I love it, that's the name. Because the name has no equity yet, you know, we just have like-
build a brand.
Yeah, it's like black text on a white page and it just looks like a word, but they understand why it works, and then like now the goal is to build the equity around that. And if you ask founders, you know, typically like 12 months later, they're like, okay, this is the name. This is the word I'm gonna say more than any other word for the next 5-10 years. Let's build that equity around it, you know.
Are there examples of these companies?
That we've helped name?
Yeah, well, yeah, where the founder was like, this is interesting, fine. But then 12 months later, it's like, cool, this is the name.
Florence, which is a portfolio company, and they did an acquisition of another company called Zipnosis. And remember they came to me, and this is an interesting one too, right? Because it's not 0 to 1. Like these are two companies that existed, but because of this merger, they were like, we needed to think of a new name to bring everybody along and feel like they're all building the same thing versus being like, okay, now they're part of the Florence team, but they were formerly in Zipnosis. And we did this naming process, and it was a lot more people around the table because they were a bigger team, a bigger leadership team. And I remember we ended up on Fabric, which again, you hear the word fabric, but Fabric Health. But then one of the reasons we came up with Fabric was because when you're in the hospital, when you're getting care, like you want comfort, and like oftentimes you get like a blanket or fabric. And then they were thinking about like building like an internal tool that was like messaging or communications, and I was like, you can call that, you know, threads, which, you know, now you have like Instagram has threads. But it's interesting when you think of a name that can also have like the brand architecture that you build off of like a system, you know, so like Fabric, Threads, you can think of Cloth could be a product name. And so that's one I think was really interesting, and it was really fun because there was a little bit more pressure, right? It was an existing company, you had to really land it. You're not going like 0 to 1 with like 3 people and then anyone who joins only knows that name. You have people who were there that now are having to, you know, associate to a new name. And so a bit trickier in terms of building that equity, but they've done a tremendous job, and they worked with a credible agency to build a website. And I think they did it justice in terms of like how to bring it to life and how to build that equity pretty quickly.
Yeah, touch a bit more on Thrive's merch. It has been, I don't know when it was, you got a bunch of views on Twitter, which I think is great. How do you think of it? What's the thought there? How'd the flag come to life? And talk through that and the ways just the things you've made. I think the design is great. Outside, I ran into Jake. I don't know if this is new. He had like a bag. He had like a duffel bag. I was like, this looks great. And so you've consistently made things throughout your career, especially here at Thrive, which are very tangible, which look great. And talk about that.
Yeah, you know, I think I gotta give a shout out to one of my coworkers. Her name is Laura, and you know, we're a team that does the merch, so she's incredible. One of the things I enjoy about Thrive is the ability to do things that I didn't expect to do, right? So now, like, essentially building like a clothing brand for Thrive. And so we take a lot of pride in like, how do we embody the same values that Thrive wants, like I mentioned earlier, you know, being very thoughtful, very intentional, very detail oriented. And so when we think about our swag or our merch, oftentimes, you know, it's something that we give to our founders, to our LPs. And so we want them to be proud to wear this. They probably get a lot of stuff from a lot of different companies and firms. And so what's going to make us stand out? And I think for us, it's ironically not to stand out. It's like how do you kind of stay muted and a little bit behind the scenes. And so again, that's why we put the logos on the sleeve.
Yeah, are there any people you look up to?
I think being in Soho in New York is actually a kind of a way that I get to see brands. You know, I think you look around here and you see some incredible brands that are being built. Kith, ALD. One thing I try to be very mindful of is our audience, right? Like, as much as I want to put an LP in like a boxy hoodie, that like looks cool. Like in Soho, like I also want to respect for the fact that are they actually going to wear this, right? And so how do you find your version of what I think is being successful in brands and clothing? But I do take a lot of inspiration from like the quality, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to go to these stores and see like the embroidery, the detail, is something that we try to do too. So we have these local embroiders we work with that know us now, and they know the quality we want and the style.
Do you know Ronnie and Kit?
No, I haven't met Ronnie.
Are there any? Actually, maybe teach me / audience. I don't know who are the Ronnies of the world, who are the Kits of the world, or who are the APCs or Druthers of the world that are a bit more low key, but have done phenomenally well.
I mean, I think Teddy Santis at ALD. Okay. I think he's actually close with Ronnie. There's a bunch of good brands out in California, Mad Happy or Cherry LA, which I look at, and I think they do some great work. I mean, even if you look at like companies like On, right? Like that's just down the street, like On running.
Oh, On Cloud's right here?
Yeah, they're down too far. And like, I think that's an amazing, I mean, they went after such a tough market, right? The sneaker, the running brand, and now they're like, ubiquitous with running, and they have an incredible brand, and they have incredible athletes. And so I think you look at, and again, that's one of the luxuries of working and living in New York is like you get exposure to these things, even if you're not expecting to get exposure. Yeah. And on the flag, you asked me about the flags, sometimes Josh will walk by and just like prompt me with something, and it becomes like a project, which is always fun. And I remember he came by my desk one day, and he's just like, one of the tenants in the building was leaving, and so we had the opportunity to hang another flag. And he came up to me, he's like, Frank, 2 flags. What do we do? And I remember being like, and when he says that, you can't just be like, all right, let me just put another logo flag up there. I remember putting a whole presentation together, mocking things up. I mean, there were some bad ideas I threw out there, but it was just kind of calibrate what's he liking.
What is the little guy on the flag?
Puck?
It's called Puck.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that if you're a programmer, you view the world in one way. If you're a designer, you view it in one way. If you're a venture capitalist, there's another way. But I think for each profession, if you specialize, you view the world in a fundamentally different way, where you understand things about the world that other people don't. If I had to pose the question to you of, as a designer who's worked across the spectrum, what do you understand about the world that other people don't? What would be your answer? And I think there's this like Peter Thiel question, but like, what do you, like not that question though. More so when you look at the world, when you look at this room, what stands out to you? Oh, there's symmetry between the colors, or the logo is nice and symmetric, blah, 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 right?
It's a great question. I think I'm a visual person, so I think that naturally I look at things visually first, and maybe like that's the first impression. It's interesting because design is subjective, right? Like other things are objective. Does it work, does it not work? Is it right, is it wrong? And I think design, everyone has an opinion, they should, and you can't tell them they're right or they're wrong. And so I think for me, it's like, how do you find a common denominator that allows you to kind of appreciate whatever you put as a designer, like you're proud of the work, which I think a lot of designers might not always be proud of their work. They're always kind of second guessing themselves, but also make sure that like the majority of the people who are going to interact, or if your customer base like has the same understanding of what they should have of whatever you designed, right? So if you look at a room, like does the door open the right way? Like, like the push pull thing, does a handle on a coffee mug, like does it feel right? And so I think it's like, it's a combination of being subjective, but also like having a perspective around what decisions you made. I sweat the details. That's all. You gotta sweat the details. I think the details are what like make the overall thing shine.
Actually, I want to cut you off there. Explain what that actually means.
Sweat the details?
Yeah, or explain how deep you have to go to actually to your effect. Have attention to detail, right? If you're designing something, what does that actually mean? Right. If I'm prepping for this interview, I have my own metrics of. The levels to it. Probably the highest level is go on OpenAI, and who is Frank Guzzone, and a deep research ed, right? And there's 5 more levels, 10 more levels to go. Break that down in terms of design.
Yeah, I think sweating the details is like, just, anything from like, if you want to get down to the details, like the padding on something, right? Like what does the spacing feel like, right? Like is on a button, like does everything feel like there's enough room for things to breathe? I think for me, having enjoyed the math and the sciences, that's something I actually really enjoy about product design. It's the constraints, right? You're constrained to a screen size, you're constrained to like interactions. And so I think, how do you be mindful of like layout and like spacing? And I think that's where I think the details really come into play, right? Even like the border, the shadow size, like everything that you're focusing on, I think has to be thought about, and it has to be a decision around that, right? Even if the user doesn't notice it, I think that's the most important thing. I think good design is when people don't actually pay attention to design. It's almost like so intuitive to use or to interact with or to look at that you're like, I just enjoy this, or I'm doing something that I want to do, and the visual aspect's not getting in the way. And I think that's one of the biggest things for me is like design should get out of the way. I think if you're asking, in not all cases, I think in product design especially, like in my opinion, design should not try to draw the attention or be the hero of the moment. I think it's about whatever the content is, whatever the user journey needs to be, should be the objective. And I think design should be like the vehicle of which someone does those things. So even like a door, going back to that example, the handle should be so intuitive that no one thinks about that handle again, you know, but if it's bad, you're going to think about that door sucks, right? And so that's why I think design should be just completely like, and I think it's one of like what Dieter Rams like 10 principles, like design should never get in the way. And I think that's something that I try to do. But there's opportunities when you're doing like a marketing thing or even my 3D stuff where like it should be the only thing you think about, you know?
Let's talk about talent and the design fellowship you spun up and Tess. And I think one of the cool things about Tess that you had mentioned is that she didn't really know what Thrive was. And she's an amazing designer, and that's why she is so great, right? And I think she and yourself embody the Thrive. I think if I had to describe the Thrive DNA, it would be some function of very hardworking, but also very kind and humble. I think you guys all embody that. Touch on how that relates to talent and your design fellowship and what you see as the future of your work here and the future projects.
The idea behind the design fellowship came around the fact that, one, I think, you know, we had proven out that the design function should and continue to exist. But that required, you know, resourcing was becoming a little bit trickier because it was just me, and it's, you know, and so as much as we wanted to take everything on, and we tried to take as much on, I tried to take as much as I could on, there was a bottleneck, and so that was one of the reasons. Like, okay, how do we get somebody more, you know, some additional people in house? But as Josh always says, we want to keep the team lean, right? And so we don't want to just like build a design team and like a design studio here. And so I try to be creative around like, okay, what are things that we already do at Thrive that allow us to bring, you know, strong talent in and provides them with an experience that they might not have gotten elsewhere. And so I looked at, we have, you know, the associate program, which is pretty common amongst VC firms, and ours is like typically a 2-year program where you come in, you spend 2 years, and then you either roll into a portfolio company or ideally, or, you know, somewhere in our network. And then we also have like a summer fellowship, and that's obviously a shorter time frame, which is like 3 months, 3 to 4 months. And so I thought about a combination of the two, and the reason it's a fellowship is because there is a mentorship angle to it. And so the idea is like more resourcing, and then be able to work closely with our founders, internal projects like Thrive One, and expose them to that thing. And I think what I've discovered being here is that designing in a VC firm is pretty unique, right? Like I mentioned, you get to do anything from helping name a company all the way to designing a flag. And so my goal is like, how do you bring in designers, expose them to all of that? And then at the end of the time, which is 12 to 18 months, they get to roll into a portfolio company. You know, a lot of portfolio companies ask us, hey, do you know any designers? We're looking for designers. And we're obviously going to continue to do like working with the talent team and finding outside designer. But like, what if we had designers in-house that like could get roll into these positions? And it's been amazing. You know, when Tess joined, I remember day 2, I was like, all right, let's get you in Cursor. And she was like, oh, she was intimidated. She was like, I don't know, man, I've never done this. And I was like, yeah, but you'll be all right.
You're in Cursor now, too.
I'm all in Cursor. And
are you using Figma? Is there any conversation about Figma versus Cursor in design? Figma's supposed to be the design thing.
They had an amazing product launch with all these new features and like, you know, sites, make, obviously even like slides. And I think they're doing a great job of just like continuing to find their you know, new opportunities to kind of continue to expand their offering. There's always gonna be discussions, right? I think people always want to be like, speculate what's gonna happen to a company. I think they can live in tandem, and I think they're being very creative around how, you know, they're kind of expanding their feature base. And so they are providing like a agentic, or they're providing like an AI powered, you know, tool, which I think people are getting to use who might not be comfortable going to Cursor. But for me personally, I remember this is right when, you know, our team was using Cursor a lot. We were pretty early users of it, and the engineering team was just like speaking so highly of it. But it looked like an IDE, and I was like, I've never used one. I don't even know how to start. And so I actually remember forcing myself for the holiday a year ago to do something with Cursor to kind of get over that like cold start problem. And so over the holidays, I made an iOS game called Koku, and it's a colorful Sudoku, which apparently there's a bunch of Sudoku games on the App Store. I didn't know this. And I actually went from nothing to now a game in the App Store all through Cursor.
Is it, do you think there's any quality flaws with that? Say you were to, as a designer, use your design skills to design an iOS app, use Cursor to code it, and then put it into the App Store. Do you think it's level with real iOS apps?
Not at all. I mean, I think I have a lot of bugs in it. I got to go fix it. And like,
but how close do you think it is? It 70% of the way there, or?
I mean, it got me into the store, right? Like they approved it, so it went through their whole review process, and so it met some sort of bar that requires to get an app in the App Store. Now, I think if you were to look at the code, you'd probably be like, I mean, this is also a year ago, right? So the models have gotten a lot better. You'd probably be like, wow, there's a lot of things you could have done better. But for me, that was like, okay, proof of concept. Like I can get in there and I feel more comfortable. So I remember coming back after the holidays and be like, all right, I want to get in a cursor. And the product engineering team here is incredible, and they got me set up. And they got me set up in a way now that I'm actually designing with real data. You know, I have my own Neon branch that I'm designing into. And it's been a huge unlock because now I'm happy to spend as much time as I need to on the details, on the padding, on the interaction design, on the colors, and then push the code up. And then I push the code up, and the PR is there, and then the engineers will review my code. And I will say that when I first started doing this, my code was chaos. They kind of helped me understand like what are to avoid some of these pitfalls that I was doing earlier. And so now we have a thing called Frank rules as an MVC file in Cursor. So I have to call that when I start a new thing. So it makes sure to like follow these rules, which is funny because now test uses Frank rules. And so like
that's funny.
We're going to have to change the design rules, but it's been amazing.
What do you think is the next adaptation?
The bridge between developers and designers is like closing in the right way. I think now developers can design, right, with these tools. And so I'm curious to see what the next, because we're going to be able to put things out there much more easily, how do you continue to refine the craft? So I think we're going to hopefully see, I'm actually interested in seeing, is there going to be like, if you think of the automobile, when cars first came up, we had horses and we had cars, everything was handmade, right? And so it was like expensive and hard to get. And then we had factory lines, and it was easier to get cars, and their quality's great. But people still want the handmade, right? So you want to get a Ferrari, you want to get like a Honda off the line. And I think, what is that going to mean for design, right? Is there going to be this like, are certain people going to want that handcrafted versus like what comes off a factory line? And I'm not saying factory line's not going to have designer's touch, but I think it's going to be a little bit more like volume output, you know, and maybe more of a machine versus, again, hand touched, you know, or hand curated.
Are you happy? Do you enjoy coming to work and then going home?
Totally. I think, I'm in a very fortunate position for a few reasons. I think one of the things I really enjoyed about working for myself was like the variability of things, not knowing what's the next project going to be. I get a lot of that here, right? But I also get the ability to learn a lot. And in order for me to work with a founder who's incubating a company in a certain domain, like I got to learn a lot about that domain in order to now have a perspective on like what should the name be, how do we represent this thing, how do we talk about this thing, how do we attract people to come work here. So that's one area I really enjoy. I also get to enjoy the fact that I'm building product and learning like what new tools there are, and even things like this merch stuff, which is it's kind of silly, but it's like we take it very seriously, and it's like who doesn't want to build like a clothing brand? And then the last thing I'll say is like this team is incredible, and I think you want to surround yourself with the smartest people, the most talented people, and I'm fortunate that every day I get to do that. And then with Josh specifically, like it's somebody that I really respect, and we have a good relationship. He trusts me, and I think that's pretty special, and I think it puts me in a really unique position. And now with this fellowship, I get to kind of pass that forward too. So pretty unique position to be in, which I feel very fortunate.
Do you plan to get another fellow, or what's the
I think we're excited about the program, and I think the success that it's had. I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to support projects. And so I think we're excited about bringing another design fellow on probably in Q1. And then start have maybe 2 at a time. I don't want to have too many because I also want to provide that mentorship. And I don't want to have like them feel like they're not getting enough time with me.
What are the heuristics again? A few years of experience and then.
I think it's like someone who's probably a little bit earlier in their career, who's maybe kind of thinking about their next move but doesn't know exactly what that is. I think the beauty of this program is that you get exposure and you work directly with some early stage companies. But let's say at the end of the day, you're like, hey, I kind of want to go join a growth stage company. We have those too in our portfolio, you know? So I think it's an opportunity to kind of learn a lot, get exposure to like the investment side of things, right? We get to sit in on deal flow and listen to those conversations, which I think is incredibly valuable for a designer because as we help a founder pitch their thing and like tell their story, the more times we hear other people pitch and tell their story, and you hear the discussions around why or why not this is exciting. I think these are important things that we can then take forward as we help, founders with their own stuff.
How do you think about parenting, and how do you think about that? It's such a big chapter. Does it make you more efficient with your time, or what values do you want to instill?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is a place that expects a lot, and you kind of want to put a lot into it. But something that's come very clear to me, and you hear this all the time before you have a kid, like your priorities change. You know? And I think for me, my priorities changed in the way that like I want to see my daughter as much as I can, but I still have to come to work.
Yeah.
And so what does that turn into? It's like I might have to spend a little less time with my friends, unfortunately. Especially in this phase, they're so young and they have this much dependency. And just making time for her and like providing her the experiences. I think what's been really exciting too for my wife and I is like having been in New York for 12 years now, we're getting a whole different side of New York, you know? And it's almost like, it kind of created this like, wait, New York's actually fun in this way now, right? Yeah. And so it's been really fun to experience that through her lens too, and her seeing the world, and I think it just like makes everything so much more fun. Yeah. I mean, it's challenging, of course. And so I think for me, it's priorities. Like I want to make sure I get home to see her before she goes to bed and then get back on work, you know? And just finding ways to have that balance, which is not easy, but it's doable.
Yeah. Do you want more kids?
I think so, yeah,
nice.
For sure.
Nice. Another girl, another boy.
I'm kind of I'm indifferent. You know, whatever happens. Nice. But I never thought, being a girl dad has been amazing. Like it's just so fun, and like I'm learning how to do hairstyles and stuff. You know, that I never thought I'd do. And
is your family still in Virginia?
No, so my parents actually moved out to Bethany Beach, Delaware. Yeah. My brother's in Virginia. He was in school in Fredericksburg, and he's still there. My sister's in Miami.
Nice. Oh, I didn't know you had a sister.
Yeah,
that's awesome. If there was maybe a phrase or a way that you would sum up the past portion of your life up until the present day, what would you describe it as? Maybe if there was a book, what would the title be? Or maybe in your version, instead of the title, what would the cover look like? What design would it be?
I would say something like adaptation is a superpower. You know, I think I had to adapt from like the pre-med to like a creative world, went into advertising, adapted to like from product to visual design back to like all this. And I think, and even the tools, right? Like learning all the tools, I'm self-taught. And so I think you just got to keep up with the times. And I think that's why I'm not too precious about like the medium that I'm working in, whether it's merch, a flag, or like a digital product. And I think that's just because I'm very curious. I love to learn. I like gadgets, I like technology, so I think it's like a perfect storm, and I think, it's adaptation. You got to stay with the times, and I think now, even with Cursor, it's like crazy, you know?
If there were qualities or traits you to pull from, say, 6 different people, whatever the number is, like, what trait would you pull? Or there are traits you would pull from different people?
If you hire someone, or you bring someone on the team, by default, trust them, versus making it seem like they have to like do so much good work to earn your trust, you know? And I think until they show you that you can't be trusted, and trust is obviously a heavy word, but like, then you should just default to them. You should trust that they can do these things. You should give them the autonomy. And that's something that I try to embody. It's like, give the flexibility, prompt somebody with a problem or a project, and like let them do it, come back to you, present it. And then I think you can have discussions, but I try not to like micromanage, even though it's hard because design's like all about, especially when it's like, okay, this is coming out of the Thrive design team, like it has to meet a bar, but I want them to have their own touch and their own flair. So I think one is that, like, being a leader that just automatically trusts people. I think one of my parents always said is like, just be kind. I think it's something that is easier said than done, but I think treating people with respect, somebody you want to work with, I think that just really proves valuable. And I think something that I really realized when I was doing my own working for myself, like client services is actually more important in some ways than the output that I was giving them, because I think if you deliver an incredible experience, you're receptive, you change and iterate as needed, it's just going to create a long-standing relationship with them, and then word of mouth for other people. And then another quality I'd say is, work hard, grind, get through it, figure it out. I think it's like, in my opinion, there's like no challenge you can't figure out, and I think, it's going to some are harder and may take a lot more work. You might fumble a couple times, but I think you just got to believe and follow your gut.
Cool. I like it. There's often this very linear story that one can tell. And we kind of told one now, in that, in hindsight, this story seems very sequential. But oftentimes that isn't the story, right? If you were to tell that story, where do you think are the points where it wasn't kind of the high, it was low, or even in the moment, now in hindsight, a very great story, and you can tell it very well, and you connect the dots, but at the moment there was no dot. Maybe it was pre-med to, I'm gonna be a designer, and then, okay, let me go to master's at VCU, or are there points in your story where it wasn't all amazing?
It definitely wasn't all amazing. I think my dad came to this country when he was very young. He had a grind to like provide for us, and I think that just instilled something in me that was just like, you got to figure it out. There are going to be challenges in life. Things are going to come at you. You're going to take a pivot, and you're going to have to readjust. Anytime I do those things, you just got to trust that you'll figure it out. And so I think, the transition from I think the hardest part of that transition from not being pre-med anymore to pursuing something different was like the conversation with my parents. You don't want to disappoint them. But also having clarity around myself, like, what is this risk I'm about to take? Like the one path was so linear. Like you talk about a linear path, medicine is like very straightforward. Now I'm like trying to explore things and like, is this the right thing? And so I don't think there's any I'm trying to think of like low, but I think it's more just like in moments where there was a lot of ambiguity, I think you just got to trust that like you're going to persevere and there's going to be clarity coming out of it. Yeah, and it's easier to look back and find the connecting dots, but I think at the time I was just like, you got to follow your gut, you know, and I think that's what I try to do and been doing. I'm very fortunate to be in a position. If you had asked me 5 years ago, would you ever be at a VC firm, I'd be like, what? No. And here I am.
Well, sweet. This was amazing.
Thank you so much, Sonith.
Of course. It was amazing.